Hey guys, Mr. Antoon here. This is lecture video one of two on chapter three, Federalism. It all comes under unit two as well. So here we go. So I've given you the opportunity to get some notes, handouts from it. So you'll see those attached on Google Classroom with the lecture. It's a great way to go through it, guys. I'm not; these are not points. It's optional for you. So if you're doing that, that's where we're starting at the definition of federalism here for chapter three. So, chapter three is federalism is really a balance between the national central form of government and the states, the 50 states that we have now. And obviously, is it equal? No, it's not. It actually has more of the strength comes from the central form of government, the national government, that does with states. So, no, it's not a perfect balance beam. But what is federalism, guys? It's defined as a way of organizing a nation. So, two or more levels of government have formal authority over the land. And I put a Venn diagram and told you federal government or national government and the state governments, and then obviously what they share. But please understand, this is all outlined in Article 4 of the Constitution, but it's an ebb and flow. Sometimes the federal government becomes more powerful. Sometimes it ebbs and flows, and it goes back where the states gain a little more power. And that's what we're going to talk about with the different types of federalism that go on here, guys. So there are three different ways of organizing a nation. There's unitary, confederate, and federal. And obviously, we've had all three of these to some degree. Confederate States of America, the United States, or federal. Each state was a unitary form of government when they were under the Articles. So let's talk about define these. Now you have a chart that you can actually write this stuff down and pause at any time to help you out. So the central form of government holds power and authority and regulates all the state activities. There is few or no powers for each state government. And a good example of this are the British. You could see when I go back to the graphic, it's Great Britain today. They're a unitary form of government. And citizens, you vote for the central government, the national government. You don't vote really for provinces or counties. You would vote for people who serve in the government. That's central. Confederate, and here I just want to show who they vote for. Confederate States of America, this is limited to the states have the power, and they're sovereign from each other, like our Confederate states that we had. And there are some duties for the central government, but it was very minimal, at least here. And we vote, citizens vote for people in the state government, no central government. So we call it a state form of government. And lastly, the federal government here in America, and by the way, there's the countries or areas that have Confederates today. That was the Confederate States of America flag on the left. The middle is the European Union, and on the right is NATO. So it shows you what are Confederate states. And then lastly, it's ours. It's a balance. We actually have to vote more because we vote for people who are in our state as well as local and our federal government or our national government. And when you look at this map of who has more unitary or federations today, obviously unitary wins because most countries aren't big. Sorry about the sound. They're not big, so therefore it's easy for us to it's easier for those countries to be controlled by that central form only. Okay, moving on. Why federalism? Well, it decentralizes our politics, meaning something in Texas is not going to be the same thing in Maine. Something in Washington State is not going to be the same as Texas. So therefore, it makes local states have the power to control their own what's happening in their state. There's more opportunities for them to practice. States can solve the same problem in different ways. Drinking ages, we're going to talk about. Even though it's officially to buy at 21, each state has different ways of handling it based on their state and based on what they think is important. This helps us be innovators, each state to be creative. And the consequence is diversity of public policy. This is kind of where we disagree on a lot of things. But again, it allows us to innovate. So let's talk about drinking ages. You can see in Texas here, it's family exceptions for the drinking age. Now, you can't at 18 years old go and purchase alcohol, but your parents could. And if they wanted to let you have a drink in your house, you could have alcohol. If you're actually in a restaurant and your parents purchased it for you, you can drink, which is really interesting and weird because that wasn't the case where I grew up in California. But again, you can see here in Texas some of the stuff for underage consumption, as well as some notes on those if you wanted to pause it and look at it. But again, that's officially what it is. How about speed limits? Each state has different speed limits. It used to be I think our state is 85 at this point. When you get out, in rural areas like on the 10, as you go west or east, and I know 85, it feels like 100 because everyone's going faster than the speed limit. But national speed limits were dropped in the 90s, and then each state got to pick. That's part of what federalism is. And I have a political cartoon to make fun of that back in the 90s where everybody had a different speed limit. Ours was faster than a speeding bullet. But again, you guys can see the different ones there. Some of my favorites were, kilometers per hour, 98.6, 1/2. So again, I thought it was funny to see some of those. Now, what about marriage ages? So mainly it's 18 when you become an adult, but there are some exceptions. For example, New Hampshire allows females to get married at 13 and males at 14. So there are exceptions, which is pretty shocking. But again, each state gets to decide that. In Texas here, it is 16 statutory age, and general age is 18, just so you know. Okay? Now let's talk. I have a spectrum here, which is from totalitarianism, like the dictators of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, to anarchy, which is time without government, like The Walking Dead. No government, you have to survive, and you're going to fight other people for resources. So I want to see where all of these go. For one, where would you put a utopia? Utopia to me is not really a government, but there is, so it would probably be right of center. So if you think about it, it would go to the right of center. Where would you put Confederate system? I think that's next. Okay? You'd put a Confederate system which has states control, but again, a lot of leniency going on, right of center, but closer to the center. Where would you put a unitary system, which is all the strength of the central government? You'd put it to the left more. These aren't perfect. I'm just showing you an area that they go in. Where would you put the federal system? Okay, the federal system is more of a balance between those two, so it's going to go closer to the center. So you put federal system and federalist to the right of unitary to some degree, where they have that control. Where would you put anti-federalists? The idea that they want state power. It's a little different than Confederate, but it's close to that. Okay? And lastly, where would you put Mr. Antoon's class? Because I would say I'm about right here. I'm sorry, the parties. Let's put the parties up there. Kind of in between there, guys, in the center. That's our spectrum, so it goes from left to right there. Where would you put my class? I would put myself here. Some of you guys are probably saying, no, you're way more of a dictator, Mr. Antoon. And you'd put me way over here. I don't kill people, guys. Come on. I would put myself back over here as opposed. Doesn't mean I'm a Democrat. Just means I'm more having more control and order in the classroom. Now, granted, this is on, virtually, but again, if I'm in the classroom, it's a little different. So I'm not there. All right, moving on. And the constitutional basis for federalism is in Article 6, the division of power, which gives us a supremacy clause. And this is the ladder of the law, a graphic I think you have on one of your handouts if you're using it. And it shows us at the top, we have the federal government, the national government. This is the supremacy, meaning their stuff trumps anything else, state or local. You can see here's the state like Texas, and then you can see local at the bottom here. This is how you would set it up and look at it and say, this is the hierarchy. So if Texas said you cannot carry guns or have guns in the state of Texas, that goes against the Second Amendment, and the U.S. Constitution trumps your state constitution, that gets unconstitutional. So you're going to see how they fight each other on this. You can't make a law that would trump the Constitution. But states do have a lot of leniency, and we'll talk about that as we get further. So let's talk about some of the powers we're given out of this federalism idea. You have this handout with you. You should be able to use this to take notes. And all you're doing is defining, because I've printed out a lot of the stuff and show you where it is to help you out. So enumerated or delegated means these are powers held by the federal or national government because they're outlined. Enumerated is numbered. They're outlined in the Constitution. They're literally written there. I can also say literally, which is which character from which famous show, which is now, I think, on Netflix. Rob Traeger, that's how you say it. So literally, he says. I loved how he said that, but anyways. And there's some memes on him. So the second one is implied. These are inherent. This is saying you have the power, but it's not truly outlined. For example, the powers for Congress and the president are necessary and proper in order to get the job done. This is in Article 1, Section 8. It's the elastic clause. That's why there's a rubber band there. Meaning, it's implied that you have this power. Well, Congress created the Affordable Care Act, and they used this elastic clause in order to create it. A lot of people believe it's unconstitutional, but in this case, it's not, according to the Democrats and the Congress that passed it at that time. So inherent powers are some other examples of it. Regulating immigration. Trump is tightening the regulations there. And you can see, again, it ebbs and flows based on the president. To acquire territory, like Thomas Jefferson did in 1803 when he bought the Louisiana Purchase. Again, for, I think, $15 million. It's worth way more than that. To recognize other states, inherent power. Establish a bank, inherent power. This came from the elastic clause as well. Protect the nation, print money, Obamacare. All these things are called inherent powers, guys. All right, moving on. What are powers that are called reserved? Well, those are given to the states. If it's not enumerated in the Constitution, they're reserved to the states. So the 9th and 10th Amendment would give, the 9th is the People's Amendment and the 10th is the States Amendment, okay? Concurrent means that they carry them at the same time. So powers held by both federal and states. But always remember, the federal government wins out because of the Supremacy Clause. And then lastly, denied. These are things that neither federal or state has the power to do. For example, to tax and export, you can't do that. Sorry, my thing is in the way. Nobility and even censorship are included with that as well. And I give you some of the list is denied: economic, individual, and foreign affairs. Another chart to give you enumerated clauses and then some denied. Just to you would have to register this, guys, because there could be some test questions on that. So be careful on that. So I want to go over this Venn diagram: enumerated, concurrent, and reserved. That's what ECR stands for. So there's a couple changes to this because it's old. So notice that the national power has the enumerated clause of maintaining a military or declaring war. That's a federal power, enumerated to the federal government, not the states. The states cannot declare war, like Texas can't declare war on Mexico. Okay, it has to be the United States. And then on the other side, we have reserved powers or shared powers like regulating banks or setting up schools. That's a state power. States decide what the students are going to be educated. Ours is TEA, the Texas Education Agency, that determines what you're going to be studying unless you're taking AP, and obviously it's AP College Board. But again, there's one here. Notice there's a Department of Education, and Secretary Betsy DeVos is the current Secretary of Education. A lot of conservatives believe, why do we have a federal secretary cabinet for something that's a state right? So therefore, if I'm a conservative, I don't want this to exist. And a lot of people saying Betsy DeVos is trying to destroy it and trying to give the conservative values to it, as opposed to just kind of show us how to lead us through it. So there's kind of a controversy going on today with that. The other one I want to talk about is making regulations for marriage. This is no longer the case as of 2015. So this is not a reserved power. I would take this entire chunk here and I would put it here. Okay? It is shared power, and really it's a federal power, but I wanted to show you that it's shared, that the states can have different types of stuff for the marriages, but it is a federal right. So I want to make sure you guys get that. All right, the ending part of this is taxes due. The Congress has not the states. Well, states can also do this. It's concurrent, but the federal government can tax and spend. Democrats do this way more than Republicans. So if Biden wins, he's probably going to raise taxes on the rich. We get more money, and then we're going to spend that money back on Americans. It's kind of like a socialist principle of spreading the wealth to some degree. Where in Trump in office, he lowers taxes, especially for the filthy rich and the corporations. They save all that money, and Republicans want them to inject it back into the economy, especially corporations. So again, it ebbs and flows in terms of what's good and wrong. You can fight for Democrats or Republicans on who has more power with this. But Congress gets to appropriate or spend the money. That's a term you're going to hear a lot, appropriate. And remember, the pocketbook of America is Congress, not the president, not the judges. Okay? And you can see how they can threaten to withhold funds if you do not comply with what they say. So if they say, Mr. Antoon, we're going to give you $1 million for your classroom. If I don't comply, they take that money away. Okay? And you can see there the fight over the wall between Trump, Pelosi, and again, there's part of the wall, and they're already showing you how they can conquer it without having to cut through it. But again, there's many ways the wall is good and many ways that is bad as well. Revenue bills, anytime you want to raise money, always start in the House of Representatives. Just a quick term that'll be on your test. It's from the textbook as well. The commerce power. National government regulates trade, especially between us and foreign nations and between states as well. And then the basic premise to promote the general welfare from the preamble of the Constitution. This is simply saying through tax and spend, Congress can use that money for the general welfare of people, but they cannot make a law on the general welfare. Okay, hopefully you get the basic difference there. Full faith and credit. This is each state must respect, recognize the public records, judicial decisions of other states within the United States. For example, each of you has a license, most likely, or an ID card. Each state has to respect that card. You don't have to have a Washington State driver's license in Texas. I mean, if you're from Washington State and you come here and you make this permanent, you have to change your license, but we respect them if you're driving in that state. Okay? Extradition. Let's say John Sample A from Washington commits a crime in Texas, flees back to Washington. Washington apprehends him. They will bring him back to Texas for trial. That's called extradition. We also do that with state countries as well. The goal of full faith and credit is for citizens to move seamlessly between each state with minimal legal difficulties. I can drive from Maine to California to Washington State to Florida, back to Texas if I want to. Okay? That's what's so great about our open land. All right, I'm going to talk about two different types of federalism, 2.5 types kind of. But the important one is dual, to start us out, was how we found it. And again, there's the handout you guys are going to write with. This is a system of federalism where both the states and national governments remain supreme in their own spheres. And you could see this graphic that shows you the federal in blue and the state in green, and they share little. So they have, this is their supreme, and you could see, this is their supremacy, and you could see society. The tension would only be where they share stuff. And this is kind of how we were at the beginning of our country, and they call this type of federalism layer cake federalism, where it's each layer is clearly defined in who does what. Federal, state, and even local to some degree in here as well. And this happened from 1790s, the foundation of the Constitution, to the 1930s in the Great Depression. And I found a really cool patriotic cake. Could you imagine how hard that'd be to create that? But it still looks beautiful. The second one is called cooperative federalism. And this is where we have the big federalist idea of, at the top here, let me define it for you so you get the basic idea before we do the graphic. It's a system of federalism in which power and policies are shared more often than they are defined clearly. In this case, the federal government has some of its own stuff, but it also delegates down to the states on what to do. And the states have their own stuff as well, but they're working cooperatively more together in this one, as you can see this. And this is defined by a marble cake, where it's kind of swirled together. It's hard to tell who does what, because they share costs, they share administration, the states will follow federal guidelines. The Interstate Highway Act is a good one, a cooperative one, and I'll show you that in a second. And this was from the 1930s, the Great Depression, through 1980, when we had the rise of the conservative values with Reagan and George H.W. Bush. So cooperative federalism, in 1956, Eisenhower put together the interstate highway system. And this is what you see here. And what I love about this is there's the 10 I've driven from Miami all the way to Phoenix at one point. That's the longest drive I think I made. But again, I've driven from Austin all the way to LA and San Francisco many times because my family and friends are from there. It's funny to see interstate highway in Alaska and Puerto Rico because they're just within, and Hawaii, because they're just within their own state. It's not interstate, meaning between. But you could see even numbers. There's 10, there's the 40, there's even the 20 there. There's the 80, the 90, the 70. You could see how it goes that way, east and west. Whereas the 5s, California, from San Diego to Washington or Seattle, there's the 15, there's the 25. It's pretty cool how they set it up. But again, this makes it easier for us to travel around our country. And before there was a national drinking age of 21, at least to buy, each state had a minimum legal drinking age in 1984 when I was 14. And Texas was 19, so it was even younger. So you could see the conflict we had there. And if the federal government said National Minimum Drinking Age Act, that's what NMDAA stands for. If you complied with the federal government's new drinking age of 21, you would get federal highway money from the federal government. That's awesome. If you did not comply with the drinking age, you would lose 8% now of their federal funds given to them. Wow. So again, there's like the carrot dangling to the idea of do what we say or else. So the federal government has a lot of power. It's like your parents and you're like the states. That's a decent analogy. There was even one where I Heart New York signs were told to be taken down by the federal government. And if they didn't do this, this is under Trump's administration, this was just in 2018, they'd have to pay a $14 million fine. So they settled in court. You can see here, end of the year in September, they reached a deal ahead of the deadline. There's Andrew Cuomo, the governor. I think he's the mayor now of New York, isn't he? And he was governor at the time, it looks like. And lastly, the last kind of half part of types is called New Federalism or devolution. This is decentralizing the process, transferring and delegating this federal power to the lower level. They're saying states, because conservatives want to go back to that Confederate idea that states had more power. States, you can have more power. You have more self-rule. And this is done under Nixon in the 70s, Reagan in the 80s, and Bush Sr. at the end of the 80s, early 90s. And again, you're seeing this. And let me show you a graphic of all this stuff. I have kind of a timeline that's going to walk us through it. And I want you to get this because this took me a while to do. And I really enjoyed doing this. So you could see there, federal and state power at the founding of our country. It was clearly defined. The Constitution is the red stripe across that, telling us who does what. So as you could see, as we progressed up to the Civil War, federal government gained more power over the states. Even though they're supreme, they still told the states you got to do more and more in the process. So we had a civil war. And who won the Civil War? Obviously the North. We're still called the United States of America. Look at the federal power now has more and more power than the states. Until 1929, when we changed over from the stock market crash and the Great Depression, we changed from dual federalism to cooperative federalism. So with the crash, we start to see more of a marble cake as opposed to the layer cake of dual federalism. And as you could see here, that lasted until probably Nixon-ish in the 70s. And then it was changed to this new idea where this marble cake is slowly going away. It's starting to become more clearly defined on who does what. And hopefully you understand these through visuals from that point. Okay, lastly, if I explain these very quickly again, layer cake is programs and authority to clearly define we know who does what. Marble, they share most of the stuff. Cooperative federalism, and then we use a lava cake as an example for the other one called devolution. We're going back to dual slowly, but it's still kind of marbly. That was the best one we came up with. Anyways, lastly, there's one part in there. How did they establish national supremacy here? The little handout I've given you here. Okay, so supremacy clause in the Constitution, the elastic clause, McCulloch versus Maryland, Obamacare shows you the federal powers. The power to trade given to the federal government. Gibbons versus Ogden, you don't have to know that one, but these are famous cases as well. It had to do with the steamboats back in the early 1800s. General welfare clause, promote the public good. Congress can do that, the federal government. The power to tax and spend. The executive power of President Trump at this point. The Civil War, you could see people think they fought over slavery. It was over their way of life. It was over states versus the federal government. It's the federalism concept. The plantation owners, slave owners in the South wanted to have more rights for their states, and they used slavery as kind of like that big backdrop in a sense. And then the struggle for racial equality in the 1950s, where you can see the federal government came in and said, states, you got to listen to us. You have to have equality. Brown versus the Board of Education was the big one that kind of made it equal for all. And the federal government was the reason why it happened. You could see George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, tried to stop it from happening, from integrating their school. And the National Guard was sent in by LBJ. And I don't know if Kennedy was dead at the time, but Kennedy and then LBJ sent the National Guard in to escort kids into the school. Can't imagine that time period. Had to be crazy with that. All right, we're at the end of lecture video number 1. You'll see the next one in the next couple days. I hope this helps. I'll see you guys on the next one. Hey guys, Mr. Antoon. This is lecture video number 2 of 2 for chapter 3, Federalism. It all comes under unit 2, guys. So here we go. So let's talk about, we talked about federalism in the last video and the three different types of it: dual, cooperative, and devolution or new federalism. We're now going to talk about the monetary side of things and what is known as how the government between states and federal government get along. And it's really called fiscal federalism, fiscal being money. It's defined as the pattern of taxing, spending, and providing grants in the federal system, in which each state, it's the cornerstone between the states and local government and the federal government. And that's how they kind of get along here. So there's a grant system where how they distribute this taxpayer money back to the states. So big government like Obama's government, they taxed a lot more. They took this money and they gave it back to the states to be able to spend on the citizens. So you're kind of getting that money back. You just don't see it in your pockets in a sense. So there's two types of overarching grants. And I have a handout for this as well. You guys can follow along if you're taking notes there, because it does help to write the notes out. So there's a categorical and there's a project grant. And underneath categorical, there's two types of it. I'm sorry, categorical and block. And then underneath categorical, it's project and formula. Okay? And we're going to talk about these as we move forward. So first, categorical. This is where most of the federal aid is distributed in this form. Categorical can only be used for a specific purpose. And you could see the rise from the 60s to the 2000s of how much money was spent from federal grants. For example, if you're going to build an airport in Austin, we need the money. They'll give us that money, but you got to spend that money on the airport. Natural disaster relief, like would go to New Orleans or Louisiana, they need that money. They'll get it as a categorical grant from the federal government. The other one is a project grant. I'm sorry, under categorical, the first one is project grant. Hopefully you could see the way I visualized it on the notes. And this is where state and government and local governments and even individuals could submit stuff to ask the government for help. So I could do that if I wanted to. And these project grants are given for specific purposes. Categoricals are all for specific, but again, it's basis of merit. So the NSF, the National Science Foundation, grants that are obtained by university professors for studying. I'm sure there's a lot of this that's going on with COVID and finding a vaccination and maybe drug therapies that will help us cope with COVID if we get it. But I'm going to use the example. Again, you can pause these videos to look at some of the stuff. Some of the graphics are old, but I have them there. But I have an example of, anyone seen the Eddie Murphy movie from the 1990s called Nutty Professor? He was trying to come up with a weight loss pill for himself, and they were testing rats, and he was trying to get a grant from this, or money. That's a concept that professors are trying to go after. But the one I want to give you that's real is this Race to the Top grant that was given by the Department of Education, the money that they get to give back to states. And if you could prove through merit that you hired great teachers and leaders, improved students' achievement, and all of these, you could receive this money. Well, let me show you the two states that won. It was Delaware was given $100 million for second place, and Tennessee won and was given $500 million for their schools. So you're seeing how the federal government can come into play. That could be my taxpayer money going to Delaware or even Tennessee at that time. And then there's a second type of categorical grant called a formula grant. This is distributed with a formula specified, mathematical formula. You could see Medicaid is done this way, child nutrition programs. They could study maybe Austin ISD, and they could say, here's the poverty level in Austin ISD, and they're using that form, how many families are below the poverty level, to how much grant money you're going to get as a city or as a district. So you could see how that's done. And Planned Parenthood is one of the formula grants as well. The second overarching type of grant is a block grant. This is where they give you, okay, it's not as specific, but it's still kind of specific. They're saying, we're going to give you $100 million of block grant. This is what you would want, but they do more of categoricals. But you would want a block grant because you get to spend money in transportation. It doesn't tell you exactly what to buy, but they give you the money for transportation. So it's still specific, but it's not as like a formula grant. It's not a project grant with that. And you could see here, this was done under the 115th Congress in 2017-2018. A Republican senator of Utah said he wanted a bill to amend the Head Start Act to authorize block grants to states, and so on. So you guys could see, I wanted to show you what people are trying to do. It just wasn't a law, but it was somebody who was trying to act and give more to authorize block grants to schools across America. So let me ask you, categorical and block, okay, the two major ones. If I said you have to purchase this specific red car, which one would it go under? If you said categorical, right, here's a question for you, you're correct. But if I said here's a bunch of money, you got to spend it on transportation, which one would it go to? And if you said block, you're correct. Now my question is, which one would you want? That luxury car, the jet, or the yacht? The boat, the ship, whatever you want to call that thing. It looks like a yacht. Anyways, again, that's a fun side note to look at what you would get for that process. But the big question is, what happens? Now look at this graphic. There's federal grants and there's state funding. And federal grants make up a third of state budget. So that's the state budget right there on the left. So let me ask you this. What happens if the federal government shrunk or disappeared? What happens if Trump didn't give the grants and tax people and give it back? It would shrink. Wait, hold on a second. Was that Pac-Man? It is, because it looks like Pac-Man. That's why I did it. Anyways, if it shrinks like this, what happens? Well, the states have to tax their people more. How are they going to get the money? That's something that you need to think about as well. Intergovernmental relations today. Again, we get $460 billion in grants every year, a little bit for everyone. Again, if you don't follow their directives, you lose threat of penalty. So be careful of that. Like the Environmental Protection Agency, if you're doing pollution or civil rights, or even the Americans with Disabilities Act, if you do not comply, you will be unfunded and most likely penalized. So be careful. This walkway, I don't know if it's real, it looks like a model, but it shows you how it's integrated between people with wheelchairs and normal, people who can walk. So you could see what governments have to do in order to make public access to everyone equally. There are so many governments, and this is a lot of people who miss this test question. There are so many governments out there because we only have one federal government, 50 state governments. What about cities? We have 89,000 counties, cities, towns, school districts, excuse me, for almost 90,000 different governments that want grants. So this will be a test quiz question on your quiz that a lot of people miss because they did not read or they did not watch the video. So hopefully you win. Why a federal system? Because in America, we have a huge amount of land. We have to divide it up and decentralize our government. Choices by state and local government. You can see public education spending. It's a choice of a state. We're not one of the top ones. New York, Alaska, Connecticut, New Jersey, Vermont are all the top ones. The 26th Amendment allows 18-year-olds to vote now. Voter ID laws are different by state. Death penalty is different by state. It's illegal in Texas. You could see it's starting to change. Washington just changed theirs. They just made it illegal in Washington state. Executions by state. You could see California has the most inmates on death row, but Texas has executed the most. And you could see here the different types of the death penalty, how they do it by state, if they have it or not. Minimum wage. I'm just giving you some easy examples for federal and state. These are mainly state choices. Minimum wage laws. There's a federal minimum wage of $7.25, but your state does not have to comply. California is increasing it to $15 an hour for big companies and small companies. By 2023, this will all be done. So in 3 years. Gay marriage used to be a state right. Now it's no longer. It's the federal mandate as of 2015. Everyone, I know Alaska and Hawaii are not there, but just bear with me on that. Lastly, marijuana. I think it's up to 15 states at this point. This might be old, but again, it's 24% of America in terms of legalization. And states voting in 2020, you could see that a lot more states are voting to get it on the ballot. Which year do you think the federal government will make this legal? I think it's going to be in the year 2025. That's my guess, but I guess I'm probably going to be wrong with that. Lastly, the summary of federalism. We have layer cake federalism on the left. We have dual federalism on the left, or layer cake. We have marble or cooperative. We have lava or new federalism, where we're devolving back to the layer cake. It's making it clearer and clearer. but I wanted to give you real pictures of the cakes to make you hungry. Anyways, that's it, guys. That's lecture number 2 for chapter 3. I will see you on the next one. You guys take care.